but I still think there's some room for critique, as it's much more so a case of a show that took no risks whatsoever, versus a show admirable that they are trying to be so faithful to the source material, but just being faithful isn't going to get you anywhere. You have to actually try if you want to accomplish that kind of connection.
When an anime adapted from a manga starts going off-source and including anime original content, it typically evokes a feeling somewhere between disappointment and disgust. And an anime original ending can be even more severe. While there is no shortage of lackluster or downright awful anime original content, it still very much has a place in the adaptation business. And perhaps the best modern example of this can be found in teasing master Takagi-san, whose later installments have seemingly rectified all of my previous complaints about the first season. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because I do feel as though I wasn't giving the Takagi-san team as much credit as I should have in that earlier video. Yes, the first season could have definitely done with a bit more visual variety, and is basically just a bunch of different manga chapters smashed together in each episode, but it's not as though this was done without any thought. In order to make this video, I cross-referenced every single episode segment of the Takagi-san anime with its corresponding manga chapter, and the first season ended up being much less bland in its choices than I expected. And before I dive in, please bear with me on chapter numbers because, for some reason, there is a significant amount of discrepancy in regards to which chapter number contains what story, depending on which website you use to get your information. I don't know why, but it has made this research immensely frustrating, and I basically had to remake my spreadsheet from scratch after realizing this. So, for the sake of simplicity, I'll be going by whatever numbers the Takagi-san wiki page uses. Anyway, the last chapter adapted by Season 1 was Chapter 50, and there are a total of 51 story segments in the first season. Based solely on that, it might seem like the math doesn't add up, but again, that's not really the whole story. In addition to the regular Takagi-san manga, the anime also adapts chapters from the spin-off manga Tomorrow is Saturday, which focuses on the characters Mina, Sanae, and Yukari. And the first season of the anime contains 12 of these segments, which means that only 39 of the anime segments are from the main manga. Math aside, adding in these segments was a much stronger move in hindsight than I initially thought. It did take some time for me to warm up to them since the style of humor is a bit different, but once I did, these segments offered a welcome break from the otherwise repetitive nature of the main story segments. Speaking of which, the choices of which chapters to adapt and when to adapt them also deserve some notice. Without giving any thought to it, it's tempting to just go under the assumption that everything was adapted in order from front to back, since that seems like the simplest way to do things narratively. But that's very much not the case with Takagi-san. The anime jumps around far more often than it adapts in order, and looking at the contents of each story reveals some rather interesting arrangements. For example, let's take a look at the strength training story, in which Nishikata commits to doing push-ups every time he falls for Takagi's teasing. In the manga, this is chapter 4, but it isn't adapted in the anime until episode 3, making it the 12th segment of the show. If this had been a straightforward adaptation, it would have been the last segment of episode 1. Considering that this is a mild breaking point for Nishikata, it wouldn't make sense to put it so early in the lineup. So holding off until episode 3, an episode number that is most often associated with some kind of twist or turning point, feels like a much better choice for its placement. Perhaps the most obvious reordering for the better would be Chapter 21, Changing Seats, being pushed all the way back to the very last slot in Season 1. In this chapter, Nishikata's class changes the seating order, which separates him from Takagi, thus making him realize that, despite all the teasing, he actually enjoyed being around Takagi quite a lot and is disappointed that he won't be near her in class anymore. Fortunately for him, a series of seat trades lands Takagi right back at his side, thus easing his melancholy. Briefly taking away the core premise of the entire show is the most obvious choice for a strong, memorable finale, so adapting this chapter at any other point would have had far less impact. While these aren't major changes, they are noteworthy enough to say that Season 1 of Takagi-san does have more effort put into its adaptation than meets the eye. That said, Season 1's changes are still minuscule in comparison to what comes next. Season 2's chapter spread isn't that much different from Season 1's, with the bulk being adapted from the 43 to 84 range. It also occasionally dips back into Season 1 territory to hit a few chapters that were skipped over, plus it adapts 10 side story chapters from Tomorrow is Saturday. However, the actual number of chapters adapted from that general range is significantly lower, by which I mean a little more than half of the total range. So where then do we get enough material for Season 2 to compensate? This brings us to the biggest change in this season with the addition of anime original content. In Season 2, there are 4 episodes that contain story segments not present in the manga, 2 of which have 1 or 2 original segments, while the other 2 are 100% anime original. The first of these segments comes at the end of the 3rd episode, titled New School Year. This segment is an extension of Forms of Address, the segment that came directly before it, and pushes even harder on the idea of getting Nishikata to say Takagi's name without the honorific. For those unfamiliar, the use of different honorifics denotes a different type of relationship to the person you're addressing, and addressing someone with no honorifics denotes a close relationship like that of a family member or a good friend. Even though he is consciously unable to, the fact that Nishikata wants to drop the honorific heavily implies that he views Takagi as much closer to him than he will openly admit, conveying to the audience that he is moving closer and closer towards a true romantic encounter with Takagi. Just over halfway through the season, we hit the first fully anime original episode, Camping Trip. On the surface, it might seem like any other episode. Takagi still teases Nishikata, the episode is broken up into smaller vignettes, Yukari's group gets their own segment, etc. But there are a few elements that make this episode stand out. The first being that the opening segment ends with a flash forward to Takagi looking back on this trip as an adult. While this doesn't have a direct chapter corollary, it is still very much a reference to another side story, or rather a sequel manga, known as Teasing Master Former Takagi-san, a series in which Takagi and Nishikata are married and have a kid together. Whether you're familiar with this particular manga or not, the fact that we get a flash forward at all signals that this trip is going to hold some sort of emotional significance for Takagi. Aside from that, the episode as a whole has a notably stronger bend towards outright romance tropes than is typical from the series up to this point. Sure, there have been brief brushes with romance before, but the sheer concentration of those moments in this episode is pretty telling of what's going on. Nishikata is very much viewing Takagi as a girl during the snack eating contest, and he even seems kind of disappointed that he wasn't holding Takagi's hand when the dance ended. The overall tone is a bit less wacky and excitable, almost trending more towards Iyashikei in certain moments, especially the stargazing segment at the end that's just so damn cute. The same could be said for the other anime original episode this season, that being the season finale, Summer Festival, which goes even further and finally has Nishikata take the initiative and hold Takagi's hand after they accidentally get separated. Even without knowing that these were anime original episodes, they were easily my favorites from this season because of how deftly they handle the subtle sweetness of the romance that is blossoming between these two. With the precedent for anime original stories firmly established, Season 3 wastes no time at all in delving even further into this kind of content, with the final segment of Episode 1, New Semester, also being anime original. The segment starts like any other standard teasing sketch, but soon transforms into a full-on dream sequence with easily the strongest visuals the series has produced so far. At first, the setup makes it appear as though it might be Nishikata's dream, but the presentation quickly shifts to reveal that it's actually Takagi's, reinforcing that she is very much in love with him and waiting for him to take the lead, which is further supplemented by the way she frames this dream as him winning. After all that, you might expect Season 3 to be filled with anime original content, and a bunch of episodes not adapted from the manga focusing on progressing the main romance. And, well, you'd be half right. There are definitely more anime original segments this season, but there actually aren't any episodes that are purely anime original. Instead, Season 3 has taken to using single chapter ideas and expounding on them to create a full episode of content, rather than a conglomerate of 4 to 5 chapters. For example, Episode 6, Culture Festival, is mostly anime original, but also makes use of the main premise from Chapter 129, Behind the School. Except instead of Nishikata asking for singing lessons, it's line memorization. Same with Episode 11, which adapts Chapter 119, Chocolate, as the episode's B-plot, while the A-plot is anime original. Perhaps the strongest example of this is in the Season 3 finale. The B-plot adapts Chapter 108, but the A-plot, which is based on Chapter 99, is significantly expanded and mostly removes Takagi from the picture until the end, thus forcing Nishikata to come to terms with his feelings and spurring him to be more assertive, with him making a mad dash to find Takagi and give her his White Day gift before the day ends. Thus, we come to the movie, a full 75 minutes of anime original content. It reinforces how the smaller nuances of these characters have gotten them to fall for each other, while also putting them on the fast track towards a relationship through a series of intimate, yet incredibly wholesome vignettes, ultimately leading us to the first time in the series where Takagi is openly upset and crying in front of Nishikata. In response to this moment of unplanned vulnerability, Nishikata finally musters up the courage to confess to Takagi, proclaiming that he will do everything in his power to make her happy forever. A moment so momentous that I damn near started shouting in the movie theater out of pure excitement. Then, as icing on the cake, we get an after-credits scene riffing on that sequel series I mentioned earlier, showing a grown-up Nishikata and Takagi with their daughter Chi, giving a sense of finality to a series that, under other circumstances, could have gone on indefinitely with not a single major change in the status quo. That is what makes the Takagi-san anime so impressive. By all rights, they didn't need to do this. They probably could have pumped out 3 seasons of Takagi-san that only adapted manga material and it might have done fine. But instead, the team behind the series decided to elevate the material given to them as best they could, amplifying the chapters that were already there and supplementing the overall story with scenarios that push these two closer and closer together until we finally reach their happy ending. And that level of passion and creativity is something that I will forever be grateful for and will continue to search for even more of across the vast sea of stories within the anime industry. Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Chris Adili, Ryan Johnson, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.